Role play. When things get serious, you've bought a property and it gets to settlement, won't settle, hasn't settled. What are your options? What do you do? James had it happen to him yesterday. Stay tuned.
I'm the ringleader, so listen up.
Good morning, Mark. Episode 542. You sold but you can't settle. That's good. A good amount of episodes.
Solid.
Sold but can't settle. So interesting. When it comes down to this and it happens, it's actually happened in a couple different scenarios in the office lately. One with a property that finally settled yesterday. But there's a couple of reasons why people are holding back at the moment. What can you do if you sounds yeah, it is and it was. There are a couple different reasons why you can't settle. It might be because there's not a document from the banks or something along the lines that just holds up the paperwork side of things.
Yep.
But from the emotional side of things,
Can we do it for dummies first? Can we just do the dummy version of like, don't know about real estate, what is settlement, exchange, and for within 10 seconds?
Yep. Go, shoot.
Okay, so what happens is when you agree on a price to buy a property and you bought the property, that's when you see the sold on a signboard. Normally it's agreed between the clients that it settles, and normally that settlement period is on or about 6 weeks' time. So in 6 weeks' time, everyone agrees that all the money is going to be changed over. So you normally up on the exchange, you pay 10%. At the end, you pay your 90%. That's when you get your key. So the day before you get your key, you inspect the property, go, this is the property, I'm happy with it. And solicitors talk, banks talk, money changes hands. That is a settlement.
Yeah, thank you for that lovely explanation.
Thank you. With hands.
That's looking real good.
Yeah.
So there's usually your 42-day period on the contract. That the final day of settlement is when the keys change hands, when the money's changed hands. There have been a couple of different reasons why internally, but in the office, a couple of deals we've worked on where maybe the vendor has wanted to change their mind. There's one yesterday with a property in Freshwater that we've just sold where the vendor just simply didn't have the documentation ready. And that can hold up the whole process. And there can be some pretty severe penalties if either side can't settle. However, it is more favorable on the vendor side, isn't it, as opposed to the purchaser side. If the purchasers can't settle, they can get penalized heavily. But if the vendor settles, purchasers need to move into the house. They're usually looking to make the move on the next day or the following couple of days. So we had an interesting one, didn't we, where it was due to settle a fortnight ago. Paperwork wasn't in. Banks weren't even informed of the transaction. So ATO hadn't been involved. There'd been, quite a lot of outstanding things. Mark, I suppose what we should ask is, what can some of the penalties be? How serious is it if you're the one that's delaying a settlement for a property transaction?
So the penalties, there's so everyone should know this, and we're not being lawyers here, but we're just giving like a mud map of what happens. There is a 2-week notice to complete period, so there's a bit of a backup plan for purchasers and a bit of a backup plan for sellers. Solicitors hate to use the backup plan. Purchasers often or agents often go, oh, don't worry, it should be right. You got 2 weeks there. You say that to a lawyer, they'll bite your head off. Now, the purchaser has to pay a penalty interest rate. That's in the contract that's been negotiated when they bought. Sort of sits around 8%, 10%, sometimes comes down lower. And that's a daily penalty interest rate, which can end up being like 5,000-10,000 in a week. So that's for the purchaser. Now, the vendor doesn't have a penalty interest rate for those first 2 weeks. That's called a notice to complete period. So what happens, it's the slap on the wrist.
Yeah.
the purchaser gives the seller, or the seller gives the purchaser. If they don't settle on the exact day, they will be issued a notice. It's called a notice to complete. We're giving you a notice, and we're going to be charging you the interest if it's going from the vendor to the purchaser, the notice to complete.
The notice to complete. It was interesting in the scenario we went through yesterday. The purchasers, they had handed in they terminated their tenancy that they were in. They needed to be out of that tenancy on that day. We worked out solutions in the end, but it just made it very, very awkward. But in this sense, it actually, there wasn't really much they could do to the vendor, because the purchasers just had to wait because they needed a roof to go over their head in the next couple of days. So yeah, it was a bit of an awkward one.
But you know what? Practicality always, like, you'd think to yourself, as like a consumer or looking from the outside in of property selling, you'd think, what a shit fight. But it always works out in some weird way. You know, when a property's sold and it goes towards what we're talking about today, settlement, it just works out. I've only ever seen in 30 years of real estate one property exchange and not go to settlement. That's not off the plan.
That wasn't off the plan. Was there
just a normal, house unit, blah blah, just 101 20-year-old property. It generally, like, and the reason I say that is because if you sell your property and you exchange and the sold goes on the sign, do you have to stress? Not at all. The odds are low.
Yeah. I found it also quite interesting, Mark, a property that we sold at auction a couple of weeks ago. Settlement is coming up. Vendors sold the property at auction unconditionally. It passed reserve, sold well above reserve actually. The property sold after that. An auction is an unconditional transaction. Is there anything that you can do if one of the parties changes their mind? In this case, I think the vendors wanted us to ask the purchasers if they wanted to rescind without penalty. Have you ever seen anything like that happen before, or was that the first encounter with that you've ever had?
Oh, I've seen it happen before. Pretty freaky. So when you sell a property and your owner rings you up and says, "Yeah, I've made a wrong decision. I don't want to sell anymore. Can you call the purchaser and ask if they don't want to settle? If we can just rip up the contract?" And we did. So I rung the purchaser, said, "Hey, you can the property, you purchased. Yeah, well, the owner's a bit nervous. Well, the owner wants to ask if you don't want to buy anymore." And then the purchaser's like, "Yeah, nah, we're definitely going ahead. Go back and tell the owners we will not. We are settling on the property." And I was like, "Okay, you." So I went back to the owners and went, "Yeah, look, unfortunately, these guys, are definitely, need to proceed." So, and you can understand that you've invested a lot emotionally as a purchaser, and you feel like you've done the deal, and you have. So yeah, that's. But put it this way: if that purchaser said, "Yeah, you know what, I'm feeling pretty uneasy about this as well," they could still mutually agree and walk away from the exchange and not settle.
Yeah. So it all comes back down to just needing to be in an agreement and then putting everything back through writing with solicitors.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's interesting. Most of them go through. I remember when I first started off here, or first started off doing some sales, the first transaction we did, it didn't settle on the day, and there were a lot of things that sort of went wrong for 2 or 3 days following. But then as soon as it settles, you sort of fall back into peace and equilibrium. But for the most part, it's straightforward. The solicitors are always on top of their clients to make sure that they have everything ready and in place beforehand. Probably comes back down to having a good solicitor that is on the ball. I'm sure all of them are.
Yeah. Yeah. And just so everyone knows that our agents really do a lot of the grunt work, leg work, even part of that legal work or whatever, getting exchange, deposit and all that up until the exchange of contracts, which is when you see the sold go on the board. And then from that point, that's when you really see your lawyers kick in, and they will take it up to the point of the key delivery, which we'll do, but that's the settlement. And then so when it doesn't settle and shit does hit the fan, it's really, that's when you're right, James, that's when you see, a good lawyer acting for you, sledgehammering at home, because this is, potentially a $500,000, $1 million deal, $2-3 million deal that these guys are doing, and it's all finite, happening at one moment on a day. So they've got to make sure they got all their eggs, all their ducks lined up, and in one line.
And Luke's just commented saying, "Don't you love simultaneous settlements where two transactions settle at the same time? Usually a buyer and a seller at the same time." I've had a couple that go extremely well, and again, the other one, it falls into, they might have removalists booked for 11 o'clock and settlement was at 11 o'clock because they think that just means it just happens in a click of a finger, and it leads to some difficult afternoons of stress for people. So always advise people to.
Yeah, it can create a chain. So say I want to buy a unit. I'm 70 and I want to buy a unit, and I'm selling my house. So these chains of settlements, simultaneous settlements, can get bloody big, up to 6 or 7 property settlements on a day. And what we mean by that is I can sell my house to a lovely young couple, one, and then I go out and buy my a house, and I want to settle on that date. 2, the people that I buy the house from want to buy a townhouse, and they want to settle on this. They do a deal and they want to settle on that same day. So that's 3. So I've seen chains where the first person in the chain stuffs up settlement, and then it kicks all the way down the chain to 6 or 7 other properties on the same day, on the same hour, not being able to settle because of a simultaneous settlement. But it does happen, yeah.
That's a good point. And I hadn't thought about that when there's more than just the two. Typically, you sort of just think it's just the one doing a buy.
Yeah, typically.
When it tips over and there's more and more and more. Yeah.
Yeah.
High pressure. So
and then what actually happens is no one really minds as much because they're getting hit for interest, but then they're hitting their buyer for interest.
Yeah.
So in that chain, there's really one person that ends up paying interest that can't recoup it, and everyone else can recoup because of simultaneous settlements.
Yeah. Interesting.
Happens.
Wow.
Absolutely. And
relax.
That is exchanged but can't settle. But we're saying it without emotion. Yours was pretty emotional this week, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, look, I think it always gets a little bit hairy when you know that there are going to be delays on the line. And again, these are people's lives we're talking about. They purchased their biggest asset. They're moving out of their biggest asset. There's a lot happening in between. So it's a stressful journey for people. And sometimes when one little thing falls out of line, it can really throw the whole process out. Unfortunately for these buyers, the vendor in this case had quite a lot of work to do to be able to settle. So they were pushed to the brink, but we settled yesterday. They're happy. Good result in the end. So interesting learning curve.
They're pommies as well, like you.
Yeah, they're pommies, just like me. So no bite, no nibble.
I'm surprised. Happy Friday, everyone. Have a great day. That is our episode, Sold But Can't Settle. And hope you're well, hope you're safe. And, hey, it's looking good out there, James, with the this news with COVID. So those percentages are smashing upwards, aren't they?
Yeah, well, the community's getting vaccinated pretty quickly at this rate. And
unbelievable.
It seems like there's a little bit of end in sight to some degree, opening back up. And also, it's spring now, Mark. It's not winter anymore. We can be happy.
Makes a difference. Makes a difference. Absolutely.
Sleep in the house. You know, it's good things are on the way.
Happy days, everyone. Have a great day, James. Thanks for doing this today with us, and have a great day.